At 9:47 a.m. on December 18, 1944, a thin winter haze drifted over a torn-up field near Foy, Belgium. Mud clung to the tracks of an American Sherman as it lurched forward, its hull shaking from every impact landing inches away. Inside the turret, the air tasted like cordite and steel dust. Outside, a German Panzer IV pushed through the smoke, its cannon already glowing faintly from repeated firing. The two tanks were less than 300 yards apart, close enough that every vibration, every metallic echo felt amplified. The Sherman's gunner, Corporal Dean Holloway, shouted bearings over the intercom, trying to steady the turret as the tank bucked sideways. The loader slammed another 75mm shell into the breech, sweat freezing on his collar despite the brutal cold. The commander scanned through the periscope, his breath fogging the lenses every few seconds. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. A flash erupted from the Panzer. A shell tore past the Sherman's bow, showering dirt and red-hot fragments across the American tank's glacis plate. The impact rattled through the hull like a hammer strike on an anvil. Holloway cursed, rotating the turret to chase the German silhouette moving through the drifting smoke. The Panzer advanced steadily, confident, its armor reflecting the morning light like a cold mirror. Yet something was off, something the Germans couldn't see. Near the rear of the Sherman, crouched behind a crate of tools and field-made gear, Private Jack Dempsey gripped a small metal canister strapped to a length of insulated pipe. Dempsey wasn't a tanker. He wasn't even a trained armorer. He was a farmer from Iowa, one who grew up repairing plows, forges, cultivator blades, and anything else that broke under long summers of heat and hard work. At first light, before the tank engines had even warmed, Dempsey had climbed onto the Sherman's hull and installed his strange contraption. The crew thought he was insane. The lieutenant protested. The maintenance sergeant threatened disciplinary action. But Dempsey insisted, because he'd seen something no manual had ever mentioned. Something about heat, steel, and how metal behaves when pushed past its limits. Now, as the Panzer advanced through smoke and burning brush, Dempsey braced himself. The German tank's armor was legendary, almost impossible to crack from the front. But if his trick worked, if the physics held together under real combat stress, then the Panzer's steel wouldn't matter. It would soften. It would fail. It would collapse like butter. And in this frozen Belgian morning, with shells landing closer every minute, Jack Dempsey was about to prove whether his melted metal idea would save the crew, or get them all killed. The battlefield south of Foy had become a shattered strip of frozen earth, where American armor struggled to hold a collapsing defensive line against a determined German push that seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour. The Sherman crews knew they were outgunned, because the Panzer IVs and Panthers pressing forward carried thicker armor, sharper optics, and guns capable of punching through a Sherman's frontal plate before most crews even finished their firing sequence. Snow mixed with smoke drifted across the open field, softening the horizon into a gray blur where black silhouettes of advancing German tanks appeared and vanished like specters stalking the American lines. For the U.S., armored platoons scattered across the tree line. Each mile of ground held tactical significance because losing this sector meant giving the enemy a direct corridor toward the supply roads, feeding the entire northern flank of the Ardennes defense. The coordination between the infantry, artillery observers, and armor units had become strained by constant shelling, intermittent communication failures, and the sheer chaos of German armored thrusts breaking through pockets of resistance at unpredictable moments. The Sherman crews understood that they were not simply holding a position, they were preventing a collapse that could roll backward through miles of forest and swallow entire battalions already stretched thin by the surprise offensive. Inside Jack Dempsey's Sherman, the men felt every disadvantage of their machine as the turret groaned during rotation and the tracks protested with metallic snaps that echoed through the frozen ground. The Sherman was agile on paper, dependable in maintenance reports, and capable of flanking maneuvers in open terrain, yet none of those theoretical strengths mattered when a Panzer appeared head-on with its cannon perfectly aligned and its armor angled to deflect nearly anything the Americans could throw at it. The crew had been taught to exploit speed, coordination, and numbers, but the narrow Belgian fields surrounded by dense trees made flanking almost impossible, turning every engagement into a brutal contest of frontal firepower and survival. The German tanks, by contrast, moved with an unsettling confidence that came from knowing their frontal plates could absorb repeated hits, while their long-barreled guns tore through American armor with terrifying consistency. Every time a Panzer advanced through the drifting haze, the crews felt a familiar dread because they had already watched too many Shermans erupt in flame when a single round found the ready rack or punched through the thinner, lower hull. The battlefield told the story clearly. The Americans were improvising, while the Germans were executing a well-rehearsed armor doctrine built around superior firepower and carefully coordinated armor infantry thrusts. Still, the Sherman crews refused to yield, digging their tracks into the churned mud and fighting for every yard, even when their visibility dropped and their radios crackled with half-broken commands that barely cut through the noise of artillery thundering behind them. The men knew their tank was not designed to duel a Panzer head-on, yet the terrain offered no other choice, and so each crew clung to instinct, training, and sheer willpower to delay the German advance long enough for reinforcements to reposition along the ridge. As the snow thickened and the air grew heavy with smoke, the American formation braced for another wave, understanding that holding the line meant surviving minutes that felt like hours under the relentless pressure of German armor rolling forward. In that tightening vice, the presence of Jack Dempsey's improvised device carried over from an Iowa farm to this frozen battlefield became the one anomaly in an otherwise hopeless equation, a tiny variable waiting to be tested against a machine built for war. The Sherman crews had been trained under a doctrine that insisted frontal engagements were to be avoided at all costs, yet the realities of the Ardennes terrain forced them into exactly the type of confrontations the manuals repeatedly warned would end in catastrophic losses for any American tank unfortunate enough to face German armor head-on. The Army's training program emphasized maneuver warfare built around flanking attacks, rapid repositioning, and concentrated fire from multiple angles, but none of those principles mattered when narrow forest lanes and frozen farmland funneled every tank into predictable kill zones controlled by patient, experienced Panzer crews. In every briefing before the offensive, instructors had reminded new tankers that German armor possessed both superior optical clarity and greater penetration power, making it essential that American tanks strike only when they could dictate the angle of engagement. However, as the winter battle intensified, it became painfully clear that the ideal conditions described in the manuals rarely existed outside controlled training ranges, where terrain was flat, visibility was stable, and targets did not fire back with armor-piercing rounds capable of slicing through a Sherman's frontal plate before the crew even registered the muzzle flash. The Sherman's 75mm guns were reliable, easy to load, and reasonably accurate, but their penetration figures lagged hopelessly behind the protection offered by the Panzer's reinforced armor, especially when combat was forced into frontal duels, where every second of hesitation could determine whether a crew survived or perished in a fireball. The instructors had emphasized that clever positioning could overcome German armor, yet those same instructors had never fought in forests choked with smoke, shrapnel, and snow that erased visibility and made coordinated flanking maneuvers nearly impossible. Inside the turret, the crew felt the consequences of these doctrinal limitations every time the gunner tried to maintain a firing solution, while the Sherman lurched violently over uneven ground, disrupting the carefully drilled sequence of aim, fire, and recoil recovery that worked flawlessly on practice fields but fell apart under real battlefield stress. Even simple tasks such as adjusting elevation or tracking a moving target became significantly harder when the tank shook under near misses that peppered the hull with heated fragments, leaving the men grappling with controls that felt sluggish compared to the smoother, more precise mechanisms inside the German tanks advancing toward them. Manuals describe the Sherman as fast and responsive, yet in the cramped turret with freezing metal vibrating against their shoulders, the crew felt every limitation the designers had accepted in favor of mass production, reliability, and speed rather than raw battlefield dominance. The Germans, meanwhile, capitalized on every one of these weaknesses, using their optical advantage to spot American armor first and fire before a Sherman crew fully understood they had been targeted, creating engagements where the Americans were forced into defensive reactions instead of the offensive maneuvers their doctrine demanded. The mismatch became even more apparent when crews realized that the Sherman's frontal armor provided little assurance against the long-barreled cannons facing them, making each direct hit a potential death sentence no amount of training could realistically prepare them for. The official stance in the field manual stated that maintaining proper engagement distance was the key to survival, yet combat regularly collapsed into brutal, close-range exchanges where the German tanks held every statistical advantage. All of this left the American crews fighting an enemy whose machines overshadowed them in firepower, armor, and lethality, turning each confrontation into a test of improvisation rather than doctrine, and making Jack Dempsey's strange farm-born insight feel less like a reckless experiment and more like the only unpredictable variable capable of shifting a fight that every manual insisted they should have already lost. The truth behind those doctrinal failures became painfully visible across the frozen Belgian countryside, where burned-out Shermans marked the routes of previous engagements, like grim mileposts, reminding every crew how quickly a frontal duel could turn into a funeral pyre. Each wreck told a silent story of a crew that never had a chance to maneuver, their tank caught in the narrow gap between theory and reality, with the first accurate German round deciding the outcome before any American gunner could fire a meaningful shot in return. Many of the surviving crews remembered the sight of turret hatches blown open by internal detonations, leaving dark plumes rising into the sky long after the fighting had moved elsewhere, painting a picture of inevitable loss that no encouraging words from commanders could erase. Jack Dempsey had ridden past several of these wrecks earlier in the week, watching snow gather on the scorched armor while recovery teams searched for any salvageable parts, and those images stayed with him as the battle intensified. He knew that every destroyed Sherman represented 5 men who had followed their training exactly as instructed, only to discover that doctrine offered little protection against a tank designed specifically to dominate frontal engagements with overwhelming firepower and hardened steel. Over the radio, static-filled fragments of calls frequently carried the same chilling phrases: "We're hit, no traverse," or "Bail out now," each one followed by long silences that told the rest of the story without needing confirmation from headquarters. As the German advance pressed deeper into the American line, entire platoons found themselves fighting with reduced strength because crews from damaged tanks were reassigned hastily, shaken, and often wounded, yet still forced to climb into new machines and continue the fight despite the knowledge that another frontal duel could end identically to the last. The psychological weight of watching friendly tanks erupt in flames just a few hundred yards away wore on the men more heavily than the freezing wind, because every violent fireball reminded them that they were participating in a contest tilted brutally against their survival. Even seasoned commanders struggled to maintain composure when the front erupted with simultaneous impacts, turning the battlefield into a blinding mixture of snow, smoke, and shrapnel that obscured movement and erased any hope of coordinating the flanking maneuvers their doctrine relied upon. In one engagement earlier that morning, Dempsey's platoon had lost a Sherman that attempted to reposition through a gap in the tree line, only to be struck by a perfectly timed German round that detonated the ammunition rack before the crew could react, sending a column of flame skyward that illuminated the forest like a sudden signal flare. The surviving crews felt a familiar stab of helplessness as they pressed forward anyway, guided more by necessity than confidence, because retreat meant abandoning the infantry units relying on their armor to hold the line against encirclement. Each loss tightened the noose around the American defense, reducing the margin for error to nearly zero, and forcing every Sherman crew to confront the simple, brutal truth that their machines were not designed for the kind of battle unfolding before them. Amid that growing pressure, Dempsey's improvised idea no longer seemed like a reckless gamble, but instead appeared to be the only fragment of unpredictability the Americans could introduce into a fight controlled almost entirely by the strengths of German engineering. The mounting casualties, the visible wrecks, and the desperate chatter on the radio all pointed toward an impending collapse, unless anything shifted the balance, and Dempsey understood that his untested trick might be the first real deviation from a pattern that had already claimed too many lives. The deeper Jack Dempsey studied the wrecked Sherman hulls scattered along the forest road, the more he realized that the catastrophic losses were not simply the result of superior German tactics, but rather the unavoidable consequence of a fundamental mismatch in metallurgical design between American and German armor philosophy that had quietly dictated the outcome of countless engagements since the first tanks clashed in Europe. The Americans had built their Shermans with moderate armor thickness to prioritize mobility, maintenance efficiency, and mass production, believing that speed and numbers would compensate for any shortcomings, while the Germans had invested heavily in hardened frontal plates forged to withstand direct kinetic strikes far beyond what the Sherman's 75mm gun could deliver at practical battlefield ranges. Dempsey noticed that many penetrations on destroyed Shermans displayed the same telltale signature, a clean entry hole with spalling patterns radiating inward, showing that the armor's internal structure fractured violently when struck by high-velocity rounds, producing razor-sharp fragments that ricocheted through the crew compartment with lethal force. Conversely, when he examined abandoned German tanks that had been hit by American fire, he saw that most impacts left only shallow craters or bent steel plates where the Sherman rounds had flattened without delivering enough energy to breach the hardened metal. These differences confirmed a pattern he had long suspected from his years repairing farm equipment. Hardness and toughness existed in tension, and steel engineered to resist penetration could also become vulnerable to sudden thermal or structural shock if its internal crystalline lattice was pushed beyond a narrow tolerance window. The Panzer's armor, while exceptionally hardened, relied heavily on consistent temperature stability to maintain its resistance to impact, meaning that abrupt shifts from cold to extreme heat or the reverse could create microfractures that spread rapidly under stress, weakening sections of the plate just enough to alter how it absorbed the next incoming force. Dempsey had seen the same effect countless times on his farm when winter-chilled plow blades cracked after being thrust into blazing forge coals, producing a sharp snapping sound identical to what he heard when German armor occasionally sheared during artillery barrages that struck directly against plates already stressed by long hours of cold weather maneuvering. He realized that if the Americans could introduce a rapid thermal shock at a precise point on the Panzer's frontal armor, they might create a weakness that the Sherman's gun, despite its limitations, could finally exploit. Yet, the official American manuals never mentioned this phenomenon, because wartime engineering reports typically focused on penetration values, muzzle velocities, and armor thickness, while rarely acknowledging temperature-dependent variables that local farmers understood intuitively through years of working with metal in harsh, fluctuating climates. Dempsey knew the instructors would have dismissed his observations as irrelevant, but the battlefield evidence supported his theory more clearly than any textbook, especially when he found a Panzer plate that had warped noticeably after an artillery shell detonated nearby without actually penetrating the surface. The metal had buckled slightly, forming a ripple that suggested the underlying structure had lost uniformity, which to Dempsey meant that the right kind of thermal disruption, applied at the right moment, could transform the armor's greatest advantage into a hidden flaw waiting to be exposed. As the Sherman crew prepared for another confrontation that morning, Dempsey understood that their survival depended on exploiting this metallurgical vulnerability, rather than relying on the conventional tactics that had repeatedly failed against superior German engineering. The discovery offered a narrow but crucial window of possibility, one that might finally allow an outmatched American tank to confront a Panzer on equal terms, by undermining the very steel the Germans trusted to keep them alive. Jack Dempsey first recognized the battlefield relevance of his farm-forged experience late one evening, when he examined a discarded German armor plate that had been left near the supply road after engineers attempted to cut it for scrap but abandoned the effort due to its extraordinary hardness and inconsistent brittleness. As he brushed away the frost coating its surface, he felt the subtle ripple under his glove, a faint deformation identical to what he had seen countless times on farm tools that cracked after being thrust abruptly from winter air into the orange glow of a forge. That familiar texture ignited an idea he had never considered seriously until that moment, because the Panzer armor displayed the exact combination of rigidity and shock-sensitive brittleness that formed the basis of every tool failure he had ever repaired during Iowa's harsh seasonal swings. He lifted the plate toward the lantern light and traced the fine hairline fractures spidering outward from the warped region, remembering how plow blades stored in the cold barn would sometimes split cleanly after brief exposure to a blowtorch, even when the metal appeared flawless moments earlier. The realization struck him harder than any artillery blast. If he could induce the same thermal shock on a Panzer's frontal plate during combat, the hardened steel might fracture internally, creating a weakness invisible to the naked eye, but devastatingly exploitable by a Sherman's underpowered gun. He spent minutes running his thumb over the jagged surface, replaying every memory of shattered cultivator teeth, cracked tractor hitches, and broken harrow joints, all of which had failed for the same simple metallurgical reason. Steel, when pushed beyond its thermal tolerance, would betray itself regardless of its engineered strength. The battlefield around him offered little time for deep contemplation, yet his mind raced through the possibilities with a clarity sharpened by necessity, because he knew the American crews had no viable alternative besides continuing to engage in frontal duels they could not win. He understood that his insight would sound absurd to trained tankers who trusted technical manuals more than the intuition of a farmhand, but he also recognized that war rewarded not the conventional student but the man who noticed patterns others overlooked. As he knelt beside the fractured plate, he realized that the solution would require an artificial source of heat intense enough to deliver a rapid, localized temperature spike, followed by an immediate cool-down from the freezing air that surrounded every tank on the Ardennes battlefield. The logistics seemed daunting, yet Dempsey's farm upbringing taught him that improvisation was often the difference between a failed harvest and a salvageable one, so he began experimenting with the materials available in the maintenance depot. He tested small sections of metal by exposing them to heated canisters, field burners, and even repurposed engine components, noting how different alloys reacted when forced through sudden, violent temperature shifts. With each test, he grew more convinced that the Panzer armor shared the same vulnerability as the hardened steel he had repaired for years, and the thought steeled his determination to create a device that could be mounted quickly onto a Sherman without interfering with firing operations or turret traverse. During a brief lull in the fighting, he assembled a prototype consisting of an insulated pipe, a repurposed fuel canister, and a directional heating nozzle that could blast focused heat directly onto a specific point of enemy armor. The device looked crude, even ridiculous, yet when he tested it against a scrap section of German plate, the metal produced a soft popping sound, followed by a sudden, unmistakable crack that spread across the surface like a breaking sheet of ice. In that moment, Dempsey felt a surge of certainty stronger than any he had experienced since arriving in Europe, because the sound echoed the exact failure pattern he had known since childhood, proving that the battlefield and the farm obeyed the same physics. The insight was no longer theoretical, it was a weapon waiting to be tested under fire. When Jack Dempsey finally carried his improvised thermal device toward the Sherman that cold morning, he knew he was crossing a line every manual and maintenance directive had drawn clearly, because no regulation permitted untested field modifications to be mounted on armored vehicles engaged in frontline combat. The lieutenant met him with a bewildered stare, unable to comprehend why a quiet farmhand was approaching his tank, holding a contraption built from scavenged pipes, fuel canisters, and spare insulation strips repurposed from engine repair kits. Dempsey explained the concept with calm conviction, outlining the metallurgical flaw he had discovered and the method by which rapid, localized heating could destabilize the Panzer's hardened frontal plate, yet every word seemed to deepen the officer's confusion rather than inspire confidence. The loader laughed nervously, insisting that heating a German tank in the middle of a firefight sounded like something out of a bad barracks joke, while the gunner shook his head and muttered that the enemy would probably blow them apart long before any makeshift device could perform whatever miracle Dempsey imagined. Even the maintenance sergeant, normally open to unconventional fixes, reacted with open hostility, warning that unauthorized modifications could result in immediate disciplinary charges and potential court-martial if the equipment caused a malfunction that endangered the crew. Despite the rejection swirling around him, Dempsey stood firm, because he had witnessed enough broken plows, cracked chisels, and snapped harrow blades to recognize the exact sort of failure waiting beneath the Panzer's armor, if only the right stress could be applied at the right moment. As he spoke, the distant rumble of advancing German armor grew steadily louder, shaking loose snow from tree branches and underscoring the urgency of the moment with an unmistakable reminder that no amount of doctrinal purity would save them from an approaching tank built to dominate every frontal exchange. Dempsey calmly demonstrated how his device could be strapped along the Sherman's hull using existing mounting brackets, explaining that its weight was negligible and its heating nozzle could be activated by a simple pull lever routed into the turret compartment. The lieutenant paced in silence for several seconds, torn between military protocol and the unspoken desperation that accompanied every battle in which his crew had faced German armor under impossible conditions, and finally gave a reluctant nod that carried equal parts resignation and fragile hope. The crew watched skeptically as Dempsey secured the device, tightening each strap with measured care while the wind lashed against the exposed metal and scattered thin ice crystals across the hull. The gunner whispered that they were gambling their lives on a farmer's guess, yet even he recognized that the usual tactics had failed repeatedly, leaving improvisation as the only remaining path that offered any real chance of survival. Dempsey finished the installation quickly, ensuring the insulated pipe aligned with the Sherman's forward arc so the heating jet could strike the German tank's frontal plate during the opening seconds of an engagement, when the enemy least expected an unconventional countermeasure. When he briefed the crew on how to trigger the device, they listened with a mixture of apprehension and faint curiosity, gradually realizing that the method required almost no change to their firing sequence, aside from a brief activation window immediately before the gunner lined up his shot. The lieutenant finally exhaled slowly, acknowledging that the idea was unorthodox yet undeniably grounded in a kind of practical logic that battlefield desperation often elevated into strategic necessity. As the tank engine roared to life and the treads began grinding over frozen earth, Dempsey stepped back from the hull, his gloves still warm from handling the device, and watched the Sherman disappear into drifting smoke with the fragile conviction that his forbidden invention might rewrite the terms of a battle every manual insisted was already lost. In that moment, the rule was broken, and the war, at least for one crew, would never be fought the same way again. The Sherman rolled toward the front line with a tense determination, its engine growling against the frozen wind as the crew braced for the inevitable moment when theory and reality would collide in a single violent instant. The fields ahead were veiled in drifting smoke that curled low to the ground, cloaking the movements of distant armor and creating an eerie silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the tank's steel tracks grinding across ice-hardened soil. Through the periscope, the lieutenant spotted the shadowy outline of a German Panzer emerging from the haze, its turrets swiveling with cold precision as it searched for targets along the shattered ridge. Inside the turret, the gunner steadied his breathing while adjusting the elevation wheel, knowing that their survival now hinged on a device cobbled together from spare parts by a farmer who claimed to understand the secret weakness embedded in German steel. The loader kept one hand on the next shell, his nerves fraying as he listened to the engine pitch rise and fall with every uneven patch of terrain, aware that the slightest delay during the loading sequence could widen the gap between life and death. Meanwhile, the pull lever connected to Dempsey's improvised heating unit dangled beside the commander's seat, its thin metal cable vibrating lightly with each jolt, as if reminding them that the one untested idea they carried might be the only variable the enemy had not prepared for. As the Sherman crested a shallow rise, the Panzer fired first, sending a shell slamming into the ground just ahead of them, lifting a violent plume of dirt and glowing fragments that peppered the hull like a storm of burning hail. The shock rattled the crew, but the lieutenant barked orders with sharp clarity, directing the driver to angle slightly right while maintaining forward momentum so the gunner could acquire a clean line of sight. The moment the German tank adjusted its aim for a second shot, the commander wrapped his hand around the activation lever and hesitated only long enough to ensure the gunner was ready to fire immediately after the thermal strike. When he pulled the lever, a deep metallic thump resonated through the hull as the heating unit released a concentrated jet of scorching air that blasted across the Sherman's frontal arc, creating a thin ribbon of shimmering distortion that sliced through the smoke and struck the Panzer's armor. For a brief second, nothing seemed to happen, and the crew feared the device had failed exactly when they needed it most. Yet the gunner noticed a faint wavering light across the German plate, as though the steel were reacting unevenly to the sudden thermal surge pulsing against its hardened surface. The Sherman's gun roared a heartbeat later, sending a 75mm shell screaming toward the briefly distorted patch of Panzer armor, and the impact produced a sharp metallic crack, unlike the dull thud they had grown accustomed to during failed frontal engagements. A jagged line ruptured across the German plate, spreading outward with startling speed, as internal microfractures connected under the sudden strain, producing a sound eerily similar to ice fracturing beneath heavy boots on a frozen lake. The Panzer lurched as its frontal armor buckled in a way no German crew expected, and a burst of smoke erupted from the weakened joint where the shell had pierced deeper than doctrine deemed possible. Inside the Sherman, disbelief washed over the crew as they realized the impossible had occurred. The Panzer's greatest strength had been compromised by a weapon not found in any manual or supply catalog, but forged from intuition, desperation, and a farmhand's understanding of how steel truly behaved under duress. The lieutenant ordered the gunner to fire again, and the second shot hammered into the already fractured plate, driving a crack across the turret ring and forcing the Panzer to halt abruptly as flames licked through the breach in its once invulnerable armor. For the first time in the entire campaign, the Sherman crew watched a German tank break under conditions they had been trained to fear, and in that shattering moment, Dempsey's untested invention proved that the battlefield still had room for ideas that defied every expectation. The moment the Panzer's armor cracked open, the Sherman crew felt a surge of momentum unlike anything they had experienced in previous engagements, and the lieutenant immediately pushed the advantage by ordering the driver to advance while maintaining a tight angle that kept their frontal arc presented at the narrowest possible profile. Smoke curled from the ruptured plate of the German tank, drifting in thin gray ribbons across the battlefield as the Sherman's tracks tore through the frozen soil, propelling the vehicle forward with a determination born from equal parts disbelief and rising confidence. Through the gunner's sight, the silhouette of the damaged Panzer wavered behind the shifting haze, its turret rotating sluggishly as the crew inside attempted to realign their cannon, despite the catastrophic structural failure spreading across their frontal armor. The gunner steadied his breath, adjusting the traverse to follow the German tank's desperate pivot, knowing that a wounded Panzer was still capable of firing a lethal shot if given even a moment's opportunity. The loader slammed another shell into the breach with renewed urgency, motivated by the staggering realization that their own firepower, so often dismissed as inadequate, could finally exploit the fractures ripping through the German armor like veins of shattered glass. As the Sherman closed the distance, the lieutenant shouted for a second activation of Dempsey's heating device, believing that further thermal disruption might accelerate the internal breakdown already undermining the Panzer's defensive strength. When the lever was pulled again, another surge of heat rippled forward, distorting the air around the Sherman's bow and striking the compromised German plate with a wavering flash that deepened the existing fissures. The Panzer attempted to reverse, its engine roaring with labored intensity, but the vehicle struggled to gain traction on the icy ground, its treads slipping violently as the fractured armor flexed under the shifting weight of the retreat. The Sherman's gun fired at that exact moment, unleashing a 75mm round that punched directly into the weakened seam along the Panzer's glacis, producing a thunderous detonation that sent fragments of hot steel spinning outward in a chaotic spray. Inside the Sherman, the crew felt the recoil slam through the turret, but the gunner was already adjusting for another shot, unwilling to grant the German crew even a second to recover. Flames began licking through the widening breach on the Panzer's front, illuminating the thick smoke rising from its engine compartment as the structural integrity of the entire vehicle visibly faltered. The German turret slowed, then froze mid-turn, its gears grinding briefly before falling silent, betrayed by internal misalignment caused by the massive stresses radiating from the fractured plate. The lieutenant ordered the driver to hold position as the gunner lined up a final shot aimed at the exposed turret ring, knowing that striking the joint would either incapacitate the crew or ignite the ammunition stored inside. The shell fired with a fierce metallic report, smashing into the weak point with devastating precision and triggering an eruption of fire that engulfed the Panzer in a plume of orange flames, sending a shockwave rippling through the cold air and scattering snow in a brilliant, violent burst. For several long seconds, the battlefield fell strangely quiet, broken only by the crackling of burning steel and the distant rumble of other tanks maneuvering through the smoke-choked forest. The Sherman crew sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they had accomplished, because they had just defeated a Panzer in a frontal duel, something every manual, instructor, and battlefield statistic insisted was practically impossible. The lieutenant finally exhaled, his voice unsteady, as he acknowledged that Dempsey's strange, improvised invention had turned the tide of an engagement they were never meant to survive. In that moment, the crew understood that the impossible had been rewritten, and the battlefield had witnessed the birth of a tactic no German tanker could have anticipated. The destruction of the Panzer left a lingering stillness across the battlefield, as if the violent explosion had momentarily stunned the surrounding forest into silence, allowing the Sherman crew a rare moment to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired in those chaotic minutes. Through the drifting smoke, the crew watched the burning German tank slowly collapse inward, its once imposing silhouette reduced to a twisted carcass of glowing steel that crackled under the strain of its own failing structure. The lieutenant removed his headset with trembling hands, realizing that their improbable victory would challenge every assumption the armored corps held about frontal engagements against German tanks. Inside the turret, the gunner leaned back against the cold steel wall, replaying the sequence of shots in his mind with a mixture of disbelief and pride, fully aware that none of it would have been possible without the strange thermal device Dempsey had fashioned from scavenged parts and quiet conviction. The loader stared through the open hatch in stunned silence, watching black smoke twist into the gray sky, while contemplating how many times they had seen American tanks fall victim to the same kind of frontal exchange they had just survived through ingenuity rather than firepower. Even the driver, usually stoic and unshaken by combat, muttered softly that he had never imagined watching a Panzer's armor soften and fracture under conditions no manual had ever described. As the smoke began to clear, a small reconnaissance team emerged cautiously from the tree line, drawn by the explosion that had shattered the calm moments earlier, and their expressions shifted from confusion to incredulous awe when they saw the devastated Panzer slumped in a heap of molten metal. The team sergeant approached the Sherman with wide eyes, demanding to know how an American crew had managed to destroy a German tank head-on without suffering the catastrophic losses that usually accompanied such reckless engagements. The lieutenant exchanged a brief glance with his crew before gesturing toward the crude thermal device clamped along the hull, explaining its purpose with understated brevity that barely conveyed the extraordinary risk involved. Word spread quickly through the nearby units as other tank crews gathered around the smoking wreck, studying the fractured armor with a mixture of fascination and disbelief, each one recognizing that the jagged fissures running across the steel surface bore no resemblance to the typical penetration marks left by standard American munitions. Several engineers arrived shortly thereafter, documenting the damage with meticulous care, tracing the pattern of cracks radiating from the initial impact point while murmuring among themselves about the anomalous structural failure they could not immediately explain. Their astonishment only grew when they learned that the decisive factor had not been a new shell type or a classified weapon, but rather a makeshift device built by a farmhand with no formal engineering training. The lieutenant stood quietly beside the Sherman as the engineers examined the wreckage, reflecting on how close his crew had come to disaster and how profoundly the battle had shifted because of one man's willingness to defy convention. He understood that the incident would soon attract official attention, and that questions would be asked about the legality and safety of field-modified equipment, but he also knew that none of those concerns would outweigh the simple reality that the device had saved their lives in a moment when no sanctioned tactic offered any hope. The crew's respect for Dempsey deepened with every passing minute, not because he had outsmarted German armor, but because he had trusted his instincts when everyone else relied on rules that no longer matched the battlefield. As the sun dipped low behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the scorched earth, the Sherman crew prepared to reposition with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with them the undeniable truth that the balance of power in armored combat had shifted, even if only by a small and fragile margin. Their victory was not merely a tactical success, it was proof that innovation, however improvised, could crack the armor of a war machine once believed unbeatable. News of the shattered Panzer spread through the battalion with surprising speed, carried from tank to tank by incredulous crews who struggled to understand how a single Sherman had accomplished what dozens of engagements had failed to achieve throughout the winter campaign. By midday, officers from neighboring companies arrived to inspect the wreckage personally, tracing their gloved hands across the warped steel as they exchanged quiet, troubled remarks about the implications of armor that could buckle under conditions previously dismissed as scientifically improbable. For many of these officers, the sight challenged years of battlefield assumptions, forcing them to reconsider long-held beliefs about German metallurgical superiority and the strict boundaries of acceptable American armored tactics. The first formal inquiry came from a team of ordnance specialists who had been sent forward to collect data on enemy armor performance, yet they quickly found themselves studying Dempsey's improvised device with the same intensity they usually reserved for classified prototypes shipped in wooden crates from stateside laboratories. They documented every component, from the insulated pipe to the repurposed fuel canister, marveling at the crude elegance of a mechanism that leveraged thermal shock more effectively than any sanctioned weapon in the American inventory. Several engineers discussed how similar principles had appeared in academic metallurgical papers, yet none had ever been translated into a battlefield application, especially not one built from spare parts by a man with no formal scientific training. News of the device reached battalion headquarters by evening, prompting the operations officer to order controlled testing in a safe clearing behind the primary defensive line, where engineers mounted the unit onto a spare Sherman and fired at target plates under carefully measured conditions. The results, though less dramatic than the initial field engagement, still produced visible fractures along the hardened panels, confirming that the thermal disruption introduced by the device significantly weakened German armor integrity when combined with standard American munitions. The officers observing the test exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that an unregulated invention had exposed a flaw in enemy armor that official doctrinal analysis had overlooked for years. Within 2 days, word reached regimental command, and a small contingent of mechanical officers arrived to record detailed sketches and operational notes, intending to forward their findings to higher headquarters for immediate evaluation. Although cautious about encouraging unauthorized field modifications, they could not ignore the tactical leverage the device provided, especially during a campaign where the Americans desperately sought any advantage that could offset the brutal effectiveness of German armor. Several commanders discreetly suggested creating additional units using materials scavenged from supply depots believing that even a limited deployment of such devices might shift the balance during critical defensive engagements along the Ardennes corridor. Despite initial reservations, crews throughout the battalion began fashioning their own versions of Dempsey's design, improvising components from heater units, welding kits, and discarded exhaust assemblies, each one replicating the core principle even if the external appearance varied wildly from tank to tank. The lieutenant who first approved the device found himself briefing other officers on proper mounting techniques, explaining how the heating arc needed to align with the Sherman's frontal gun angle to maximize the thermal shock delivered moments before firing. What began as a single unauthorized modification quietly evolved into a small but rapidly growing tactical adaptation, spreading organically through crews who understood that survival demanded innovation, even when it conflicted with the rigid boundaries of military protocol. By the end of the week, senior leadership received fragmentary but compelling after-action reports from multiple units claiming improved penetration results against German armor when using field-built thermal devices, prompting whispers that the improvised tactic might soon merit official recognition. Though no formal directive existed yet, the pattern was unmistakable. An idea born on an Iowa farm, dismissed as foolish by experienced soldiers, had begun seeding itself across the division, proving once again that the most decisive weapons in war often emerged not from laboratories or factories, but from the desperate ingenuity of men fighting for their lives on frozen, unforgiving ground. As winter tightened its grip on the Ardennes front, and the chaos of the German offensive slowly gave way to a grinding American counterpush, the story of Jack Dempsey's improvised thermal device began circulating far beyond the battered ridgelines where it had first proved its worth. Tank crews who had never met him repeated the tale with a sense of reverent disbelief, describing how a farmhand's intuition had exposed a hidden fragility in German armor that no official technical report had ever identified, transforming a battlefield rumor into a widely acknowledged testament to the unpredictable power of human ingenuity under fire. Commanders who once dismissed unconventional ideas now found themselves quietly encouraging creative problem-solving, recognizing that innovation often emerged not from sanctioned doctrine, but from the raw, unfiltered experiences of men who lived inside the machines they fought to keep alive. As the division advanced through recaptured villages, several officers spoke openly about revisiting assumptions embedded within American armored doctrine, suggesting that the war had entered a phase where flexibility mattered as much as standardization, and that Dempsey's device represented a rare moment when improvisation successfully challenged the technical dominance of German engineering. Engineers at rear area workshops began conducting more formal studies on thermal shock effects, using captured armor plates to test theories inspired directly by the results Dempsey achieved on the front line, even though few admitted publicly that their work traced back to a tank crewman with no formal certification. Each test reinforced the same conclusion. Battlefield conditions favored men who understood steel not just as a material defined by numbers, but as something alive, temperamental, and deeply influenced by the forces acting upon it. For the Sherman crews who had witnessed the improbable victory firsthand, the memory became a quiet anchor of resilience, a reminder that their survival had hinged not on superior weapons, but on one man's refusal to accept a predetermined fate dictated by enemy armor, thickness, and firing tables. They carried that lesson through every subsequent engagement, often glancing at the improvised devices strapped to their hulls with a mixture of trust and gratitude, knowing that those awkward, patched-together mechanisms represented the difference between retreating under fire and seizing the initiative against a foe long believed unbeatable. Even after standardized versions of the device began to appear in limited quantities, many crews preferred their original field-built models, believing they embodied the raw practicality and personal investment that official equipment often lacked. When the war finally pushed past the Belgian forests and into the heart of Germany, the legacy of Dempsey's invention remained etched into the mindset